Good morning, friends. I am really glad that I get to preach this Sunday as we start our focus for this month on the theme of love. For the last few years, the strongest form of love that I have felt has actually been grief. Some of you know this story already, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself to you, but on Saturday, August 14th, 2021, my entire life was flipped upside down. My mother called to tell me that the issues she was having with her vision were getting worse. She was starting to lose vision in her left eye as well. So I booked a flight to Florida, and as I got to the airport, my mother was getting the news from the emergency room staff that she actually had 2 brain tumors. By Tuesday the 17th, we knew that she actually had one multifocal glioblastoma multiforme that was both invasive and aggressive and could not be surgically removed. This was my introduction to a new form of grief. I had lost my beloved grandfather a little more than a year before my mother's diagnosis. And though I miss and grieve him every day, his death was not a tragedy. He passed in his home, in my father's arms, with my sister and I in the room with him at the age of 99. He won at life. My mother had just turned 62 when she got her news. No more than 2 weeks before, she had helped my sister and her family move into their new home in North Carolina. She ran every day, worked out. She was in amazing health, much better than mine, in fact. But during the course of her disease, it sometimes seemed like she was being tortured, and that every gain she managed to achieve was undone by some greater pain. She contracted bacterial meningitis before even being able to start treatment, which disqualified her from a trial we had hoped she'd be able to get into. While being treated for that, she spent a week in the hospital and a few days completely out of it. She lost all of her sight for a while until the radiation slowly started to shrink the tumor in her optic chasm. But eventually, her body couldn't take anymore. She started to decline about 2 days before I was supposed to drive to North Carolina to be with her again. My siblings, my brother-in-law, and nibblings for Thanksgiving. She was able to come downstairs and eat Thanksgiving dinner with us all, but then never made it downstairs again on her own. She fell the next day and was taken to the hospital via ambulance, where they discovered she had no white blood cells left. Her immune system had shut down. She passed away surrounded by her 3 children on November 29th, 2021, about 3.5 months after her diagnosis. I remember thinking when she was first diagnosed, then when she died, so many times between and after her death, that this was all just a really bad dream. And I'm not the only person who's experienced such personal grief in this world, but especially during this pandemic. I think this has risen up a lot for a lot of people. Sometimes the pandemic has felt like a really bad dream that just won't end. Some of you here likely have lost someone or known someone who you've lost. I know we've lost folks in this church during our time together during the pandemic. But even more, we've all experienced collective grief over the last few years. We've seen the devastation of COVID rip through our world. Mass shootings just keep happening. The violence against communities of color that has always been there is just becoming much more widely known. And there are other griefs, maybe smaller or maybe just different. Grief for lost time with family and friends, grief at our loss of a sense of safety or normalcy, conflict with family or friends that ends relationships because everything feels just so much harder now. And so often we see grief as one of the bad feelings And let me start by saying I could do a whole sermon on the fact that no feelings are actually bad or wrong, so I'm not going to go super far into that. But even if there were bad feelings, grief would not be one of them. Grief is hard. It's uncomfortable. But it's also a part of love. You only grieve the loss of things you love. So it cannot be bad. Actor Andrew Garfield, one of the maybe 5 million actors to play Spider-Man in recent history, also lost his mother to a devastating and terminal cancer about the same age, when he was about the same age as I was when I lost my mother. And he has an amazing take on what grief really is that I wanted to share with you all. In an interview, he said, "This is all unexpressed love, the grief that will remain with us until we pass because we never get enough time with each other. No matter if someone lives until 60, 15, or 99. So I hope this grief stays with me because it's all the unexpressed love that I didn't get to tell her. And I told her every day." So that's the crux of the matter, I think. Grief is undoubtedly hard. No one wants to feel it because that means we've lost something. But loss and change is inevitable. So really, grief is just our love transformed. It's what reminds us that that invisible string that connects us to a departed person is still actually there. A good friend of mine, our very own Amy Concannon, who I did check with about name dropping today, has experienced her own loss and grief and came to my house one day for tea and conversation not long after my mom died. She shared with me the idea of grief being a ball within a box. And the metaphor has helped me immensely as I've processed my feelings through this first year of my mother's passing. You see, the ball that is grief in the beginning, right after the loss, fills the box, us, our lives, our thoughts. It leaves a little room around the corners, but it touches all sides of the box, affecting everything else inside it. And we feel grief every time the ball touches the box. So at first, it's overwhelming. As time goes by, I think there's only 3 things that can happen, right? 1, nothing changes. The ball and the box stay the same size, and we continue to feel intense grief. We haven't been able to process our loss at all. Not ideal. 2, the ball gets smaller and starts bouncing around the box. We've figured out a way to decrease the size of our grief, but when the smaller ball touches the side of the box, we'll feel that grief again. Or 3, the box gets bigger and the ball starts bouncing around the box. We don't work to reduce the size of our grief, but we work to grow around it. Although many strive for the second option, I argue that the third is what true healing looks like and what we should aim for. That is the purest expression of grief as a form of love. For me, to reduce the size of grief from my mother feels like a betrayal. It feels like forgetting her. It might be the easier path forward to suppress, to try to move on, but I prefer to move forward and to bring my mother with me. And I'm not going to lie, when grief is really intense, it's tempting to shut down, close yourself off, dull the pain in whatever way you can, curl up in a ball and protect yourself from anything that might make you feel this way again. I have, in fact, done that. Because for maybe some amount of time, that's what we have to do to get by. Especially in this capitalist culture that only gives us 3 days off of work to grieve, if we get any, and then expects us to be back to normal and productive again. So to pay the bills, sometimes that's what we've got to do. But if we stay that way, if we never let grief break us open, we're actually making ourselves and our world smaller. Author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie wrote a book called Notes on Grief after her father passed. And in it said, "I finally understand why people get tattoos of those they have lost. The need to proclaim not merely the loss, but the love, the continuity. I am my father's daughter. It's an act of resistance and refusal. Grief telling you it is over and your heart saying it's not. Grief trying to shrink your love to the past and your heart saying it is present. Now, I disagree with her framing that it's grief that's trying to shrink your love, but I want to uplift what she said before that. That staying with your pain and loss is an act of resistance. Resistance to the shallow, unbalanced vision of what life should be in our current society that tells us that we should always be happy and that happiness can be bought. I'm not always happy, and I don't think any of you all are either, and there's nothing wrong with that. If we only ever felt happy, that would mean that we felt that the current world we live in is exactly as it should be, and that we are the best versions of ourselves in it. And what a horrible fate that would be. To actually believe that this is it, that this is as good as it can be. And yes, all those other feelings like grief and anger and sadness are harder, but they tell us something important and challenge us to grow and to change. And that's why I love the quote that I based the title of this service on from Terry Tempest Williams. Grief dares us to love once more. When I'm able to be playful with grief, which anyone who has laughed about something a lost loved one once did, or who carries on inside jokes they had with them after the loss, knows it is very possible to be playful with grief. I imagine a personified grief as one of the kids from The Sandlot, a movie I grew up with and came out in 1993, so no worries if not everyone knows it, but it included this amazingly sassy and funny character called Ham, who was redheaded, by the way. I just always like to point out when redheads are awesome. Anyway, Ham always had a comeback or a challenge, and so I can hear him in my head as grief say, "I triple dog dare you to love again." And I'm doing my best to rise up to that challenge, even though I'm scared. I continue going out into the world with an open, loving, broken heart. I keep trying to love this difficult, broken world and the imperfect, broken people in it to the best of my ability. I'm letting my grief teach me how to love even bigger and better than before. And when I sometimes curl up in a ball and shrink, all I need to do is eventually pull back that image of Ham, triple dog daring me. I know that there will be more grief and loss in my life, whether through deaths of loved ones, conflicts that cause relationships to end, oppressive systems continuing to harm grassroots communities, natural and man-made disasters, and more. But I also know that we only grieve what we love. And I'm willing to take the grief if it means I get the love. So to conclude, I triple dog dare you all to love again. To love once more, to love bigger and stronger every day. I dare you to let whatever grief comes your way to teach you what you need to know, to let it break you open and make you bigger and more loving. Amen, Ashe, and may it be so.